Welcome to Crosstalk Solutions. My name's Chris, and this is FreePBX 101 version 15, part 18, where we're going to be talking about Crosstalk SIP trunking setup. Now, thus far in this series, we have done everything locally on the FreePBX, meaning that we have had zero connectivity to the outside world, or in other words, zero connectivity to the PSTN, or Public Switched Telephone Network. But of course, one of the main reasons that you have a phone system is so that you can make phone calls to the outside world. So in this video, we're going to show you how to set up Crosstalk SIP trunking using PJ SIP. In our next video, we're going to talk about setting up Clearly IP SIP trunking, also using PJ SIP. Now here at Crosstalk Solutions, we do have 3 recommended SIP trunking providers: Crosstalk SIP, Clearly IP, and the third provider is VoIP.ms. Now I have already done a video on how to set up VoIP.ms with FreePBX using PJ SIP. I will put a link down in the description below if you are interested in checking out that video. But for now, if you are enjoying this video tutorial series, make sure you remember to give me a thumbs up and subscribe to Crosstalk Solutions so that you do not miss any future videos. Okay, so here is the dashboard of FreePBX, and you can see here that we have one error that says you currently have no emergency route set up on this system. An emergency route, of course, is for dialing, here in the United States, it's 911 to get emergency services. That number is different in other countries around the world. By the time we're done with this video, that error will be gone because we will have set up an emergency trunk. So let's hop right into it. If you're interested in signing up with Crosstalk SIP, we have various packages available, United States based only at this time, but you can see the SIP plans that we have. We do channelized plans in bundles of 5 channels or 10 channels most often, and those include a number of minutes, usually enough minutes to cover, anyone who would have a 5-channel plan, for instance. So you can see all of our pricing. We're totally transparent. There are no hidden fees. Full data sheet for long distance and international rates here, as well as full pricing for absolutely everything that you could possibly be charged for with Crosstalk SIP. We do offer a one-time charge $50 setup to actually set up these trunks, but that's exactly what we're going to be doing in this video. So if you're watching this video, you can save yourself the $50. You don't need to pay us for that. And the final thing I will say here is if you scroll down to the bottom of this Crosstalk SIP page, which again I will have linked down below, just fill out this form and we will get you started with your Crosstalk SIP trunking. Out on our public-facing knowledge base, we do have a full article for how to set up Crosstalk SIP trunking using PJ SIP on FreePBX, and essentially what we're going to do in this video is just go through this article step by step and get everything configured from start to finish. And scrolling down, the first step is to create our inbound trunk. So with Crosstalk SIP, there are 5 redundant paths for inbound and 5 redundant paths for outbound. We're going to start on the inbound side. So in FreePBX or PBExact, we want to go to Connectivity Trunks, and we're going to add a new trunk. So let's do that now. Connectivity and Trunks. Notice that we do not have any SIP trunks right now. This is going to be the first trunk that we're adding to this system. So we're going to say Add Trunk, Chan PJ SIP. Now there's 2 types of SIP. Chan SIP is deprecated. So that is an old legacy version of SIP trunking. We want the one that says Chan PJ SIP, so be very careful about that. For trunk name, we're going to say Crosstalk SIP inbound, and notice that when you hit space, it automatically puts in these underscores for you, so you don't need to worry about that. For our outbound caller ID, we're going to say 272-207-2040. I have configured this particular Crosstalk SIP trunk with a Scranton, Pennsylvania DID just to make sure that we're keeping with the theme of The Office for this video tutorial series. And that is all that we need to do on this page. Now we want to click on PJ SIP settings, and then we're going to set authentication to none. Now that doesn't mean that there is no authentication for this trunk, but Crosstalk SIP trunking uses what's called IP-based authentication, meaning that you give us your FreePBX's WAN IP address and we send calls to that WAN IP address. And then you are setting up the trunks to receive calls from the Crosstalk SIP IP addresses. So basically that is doing an IP-based authentication on both sides. So the SIP server that we are going to receive calls from primarily, if we go back to our documentation, is this one right here, 64.136.174.30. So we're going to copy that and paste it in right there. But as I was telling you earlier, there are 5 redundant inbound SIP trunks that we want to set up. So now we can click on Advanced, and then over in the article, we're going to grab the other 4 WAN IP addresses. We are going to copy those, and then we want to scroll down until we find Match Permit. And then we are going to basically paste in all of those other redundant IP addresses, basically telling this SIP trunk, you know, here's the main IP address that we're going to be receiving calls from, but we're also going to permit this trunk to receive calls from any of these other IPs. Now, just really quickly, going back to the General tab under PJ SIP settings, you'll notice that I didn't put in a SIP server port. This is because by default, we are assuming that you are on port 5060. But if you have opted to use a different port when you set up your Crosstalk SIP trunks, you would want to put that different port here. But in 99% of cases, you can leave this blank because 5060 as the default port works perfectly fine. Okay, we're going to say Submit and Apply Config. If we want to double check that our SIP trunk has taken effect, we can drop into SSH and log into our server as root. Once we are at the Linux shell, we can say *-rvvv. This is going to drop us into the * command line. And now we can say pjsip show endpoints. And what we can see here is that this trunk, Crosstalk SIP inbound, that we just created, is status available. That means that it is good to go. If you don't want to drop into SSH to check that out, I will show you one other place where you can check the trunk status. We can go to Reports and then click on *info. And then if we click on Peers and scroll all the way down, we can see the same thing right here. Here is our Crosstalk SIP inbound trunk and the status is available. Okay, so the next step of the instructions is to set up an inbound route. And an inbound route basically telling FreePBX, hey, when you receive a call, do this with that call. Now, we're going to dig into inbound routes in a lot more detail in video 20 of this series. For now, I'm just going to take any calls that come into FreePBX and I'm going to send them directly to this extension right here, which is extension 200. So let's go back to the dashboard of FreePBX. And we're going to say connectivity, and we want to choose inbound routes. We're going to add a new inbound route. For description, we're just going to call this default. Now, we're not going to route on the phone number that's dialing in. We're not going to route based on the caller ID that we receive from the external caller. Nothing like that. We're just saying any call that comes into FreePBX, we're going to set the destination to extensions and then extension 200, and we're going to say submit. And apply. And once that apply is done, I am now going to call the DID of my SIP trunk, which is 272.207.2040. I'm calling that with my cell phone right now. And there we can see the call is ringing on extension 200. Hello, hello. Check, check, check. Test, test, test. So there you have it. Congratulations. We have successfully completed an inbound call from the outside world into our FreePBX. There are a couple of more things that we need to do here, including set up our firewall as well as configured an outbound route so that we can make outbound calls from our internal extensions. And we're going to do that right after this word from our sponsor. This video is brought to you by the wonderful folks over at Crosstalk SIP. If you need SIP trunking services for your PBX, please consider Crosstalk SIP. We've designed our trunking to be competitively priced with excellent quality and full trunk redundancy for both inbound and outbound calls. We have 2 main packages for SIP trunking. Our 5-channel package is $69.99 per month and includes 4,000 minutes worth of calling. Our 10-channel package is $129.99 per month and includes 8,500 minutes worth of calling. All Crosstalk SIP trunking is 100% Carey's Law and Ray-Baum Act E911 compliant, and if you mention this video when you contact us, we'll throw in remote setup of your SIP trunks on FreePBX absolutely free. So in short, Crosstalk SIP trunking is competitively priced, fully redundant, has crystal clear call quality, is 100% compatible with FreePBX, 100% carries law and Ray Baum Act E911 compliant. We provide expert level support services for any issues that you may encounter, and as an added bonus, we will set up those trunks for you on your server. I mean, what more could you ask for? So check the link in the description below for more information on Crosstalk SIP trunking, and we look forward to having you as a customer. All right, now back to the video. All right, thank you so much for that. Now we're going to set up our firewall. If we look at the instructions on the Crosstalk SIP knowledge base, really you actually don't need to add these to the firewall. It's not required. I like to do it as just an extra safety net. By virtue of just having a PJ SIP connection out to a trunking service provider, FreePBX is smart enough to know that, hey, these IP addresses are valid because we're using them to register this SIP trunk. But I do like to add these to the firewall anyways. What you decide to do is completely up to you. So we're going to go to Connectivity and then Firewall, and then we're going to click on the Networks tab. Inside the Networks tab, we're going to add some new entries, and we want to add 5 separate entries for our 5 different Crosstalk SIP redundant IPs. So I'm going to grab the first one, copy, paste it in here, and we're going to say Crosstalk SIP 1, and then add another one. Come back over here, we're going to copy that one, paste it, Crosstalk SIP 2, and if you remember from our firewall video, I'm just leaving this as local or local trusted traffic in the local zone. Reason being is they're SIP. Anything in the local zone is going to be authorized for all of the ports that FreePBX uses, including SIP, right? So we don't have to make these, in the trusted zone where they have full access to every port on the system. Putting them in the local zone is going to be perfectly acceptable because SIP will always be in the local zone. All right, let's add another one. Okay, and we're just going to keep repeating this until we have all 5 Crosstalk SIP IP addresses authorized through the firewall in the local zone on our PBX. All 5 entries have now been entered, and similarly, we want to do the same thing for intrusion detection. So let's click on the Intrusion Detection tab next. That tab is right up here next to Networks where we were just working. And in the documentation, we can scroll down and just grab all 5 of these IP addresses at once and paste them right in. Go ahead and click Save Intrusion Detection. And now we have successfully authorized those IP addresses, or basically said, hey, these IP addresses are whitelisted. Do not ever block them with the intrusion detection functionality. The next step in this process is to create our outbound trunks as well as our outbound routes. So let's do that next. We're going to go to Connectivity Trunks. And we're going to create a new PJ SIP trunk. This one we're going to call Crosstalk SIP Outbound 1. And we're going to do 1 because there are 5 redundant trunks. We're going to do 1 through 5. So let's add the same caller ID that we used previously, which was 272.207.2040. And then we want to click on PJ SIP settings. We're going to once again set authentication to none because we are using IP-based authentication. And then let's grab the first of the 5 IP addresses. Copy that and paste it into SIP server and click submit. Now we have to repeat this 4 more times, but here's a shortcut. If you just edit the one we just did and then hit duplicate, you can now have a duplicate trunk. So we can basically just say, modify the name to say Crosstalk SIP Outbound 2, click on PJ SIP settings, and then grab the next IP address in the list. Here you can see the full list of redundant IPs and paste it in there like so. Click submit. Edit that one, duplicate, edit the duplicate, adjust the name, click on PJ SIP settings, and grab the next IP address. Now we're going to do this again and again and again until we have all 5 trunks configured. There we have all 5 trunks configured. Now we want to click Apply Config. And while we have these outbound trunks configured, we have not told FreePBX how to use them yet. So to do that, we need to create some outbound routes. And we're going to create 2 different outbound routes. We're going to have an emergency route for emergency dialing services, and then we're going to create a default outbound route for just standard calls out to the public switch telephone network. So To do that, we're going to go to Connectivity and Outbound Routes. We're going to say Add Outbound Route. Now, just like with the inbound routes, we are going to do a video specific to outbound routing. So what I'm going to set up here is just very basic, basically just enough so that when we make phone calls, it will work. But I will dig into much deeper detail on the outbound routes in video 21. All right, so for route name, we're going to call this emergency. For the route caller ID, we're going to use our same caller ID. Now, this caller ID phone number that I have here does have an associated E911 address for this number. And make very, very sure that any caller ID that you have on an emergency outbound route or any phone number that you're outpulsing when you dial 911 or whatever emergency services are in your country, you want to make sure that there is an address associated with that so that the authorities know where to show up when that is when they receive those calls. So now here's our trunk sequence for the matched routes. We're going to say Crosstalk SIP outbound 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so what this is going to do is it's always going to send calls out Crosstalk SIP outbound 1 unless there's a problem. If it can't reach that trunk for some reason, then it's going to fail to the second, the third, the fourth, and then the fifth. So that's why we have our 5 redundant outbound routes. And then finally, since this is an emergency route, we want to click on emergency. What this does is it utilizes the emergency field on each extension as the caller ID. So if someone dials 911, it's going to use this caller ID by default unless you have the emergency caller ID setting set on a per extension basis. The reason that you would want to do that is, for instance, let's say you had a company and one person is working from home. Well, when that person makes normal calls out of the system, you want to outpulse the system's normal caller ID phone number so that when people call back, they call back the right place. But you would not want to outpulse that for emergency services for a phone that is at someone's house, because then the authorities would show up to the company instead of the house. But on that extension, that one remote extension, you can set a different emergency caller ID, and it will use that emergency caller ID if that phone dials anything that matches this outbound route's dial patterns. So again, we will go into that in more detail when we cover outbound routes, but just know that everything needs to have a valid 911 caller ID when you send calls to emergency services, and that address that it outpulses has to be the correct address for where that phone is physically located. Okay, so we're going to click on dial patterns. Now, we're going to use our dial patterns wizards. Since this is a US emergency dial pattern, we're just going to uncheck everything else and click generate routes. And we created a route for 911, 933, which is actually just used to test 911 addresses. Then we have 1-911, 9-911, and 9-1-911. So what we're doing there is basically just covering anything that someone might possibly dial to get to emergency services, because you want to just be able to dial 911 and that's it. But if someone accidentally dials 9-911, well, we want that call to go through as well. The final one that I'm going to add here is 988, and that is the code for the suicide prevention hotline. We just make it a habit to include that in all of our emergency outbound routes, just in case someone ever needs to use that number. Finally, I'm going to click on additional settings, and we're going to force call recordings on this 911 or emergency outbound route. The reason that we do that is I always want to have a recording of any emergency calls that go out of the system. There are rules about recording calls based on each different state in the US, and certainly, every different country has their own rules for recording calls. Here in the US, we have single party consent and dual party consent. I'm not dealing with any of that with this call recording setting. I just want to record those calls. It may never be anything that's able to be used in a court of law. I just want to have a record of those calls just in case, right? So I always set call recordings to force on any emergency outbound route. Okay, so now we're going to click submit. And let's add a second outbound route. This one will be easier. This is just going to be a default outbound route. We're going to use the same caller ID of 272.207.2040. We're not going to click emergency, but we are going to choose each one of our outbound trunks. And then for dial patterns, we want to just do regular 7, 10, and 11 digit dialing. So I'm going to click Dial Patterns Wizards. I'm going to choose 7, 10, 11. I'm going to get rid of US emergency, and I'm going to choose long distance as well. And we're going to say generate routes. And again, I will go into this in much more detail in our outbound routing video. But what I'm doing here is here's a 7-digit dial. So just if you pick up the phone and dial 7 digits, I want to prepend to that 1272. We're adding our local area code to a 7-digit dial. To a 10-digit dial, we're adding a 1. We're going to leave an 11-digit dial alone. We don't need to modify that at all. And I'm going to add one more here, which is a plus in front of an 11-digit dial. And the reason that we do that is sometimes there are some phone models that when you click redial on the phone, it redials with a plus in front of the 11-digit number. And so we just want to make sure that we are capturing those. And we just by default do this on all of our setups. Okay, so there we go. We're going to click submit. And now we can click apply config. And we should now be able to make a call to my cell phone. So let's go ahead and try that. All right, sending the call now. Phone is ringing. Let's answer it. Hello, hello.
Hello, hello.
Check, check, check.
Check, check, check.
There we go. All right, so we have now successfully done an inbound and outbound call and done a full best practice Crosstalk SIP trunk setup using PJ SIP on FreePBX. If you have any questions about any of this, we are here to help. So with the Crosstalk SIP trunking service, you don't just get awesome phone lines, you get our assistance in helping you with your SIP trunking. Whether you just have questions about it, you need help setting it up, if there's any sort of issue about it, you contact us and we take care of it for you. All right, if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please click subscribe. In our next video, we're going to be setting up a Clearly IP SIP trunk, so very similar to what we did here, but with a different provider. All right, we will see you guys in the next video.